Welcome to Gospel Lessons. I'm Kevin Prince. Today we'll be discussing if Joseph Smith was in it for the money. Joining me is Casey Griffiths. Casey is an associate professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. Before coming to BYU, he worked for 11 years as a teacher and curriculum writer in seminaries and institute. He is an active member of the Mormon History Association, the Latter-day Saints Education Society, and the John Whitmer Historical Association. He is the co-host of the Church History Matters podcast and hosts documentaries on church history for Scripture Central. He is the author and editor of dozens of articles and several books. This series is sponsored by Go and Do Travel, which provides LDS-based cruises offering an opportunity to connect with like-minded members and learn from experts and influencers. I'll be joining the Momentum 2026 cruise, and if you're interested, use promo code PRINCE to get $100 off. All proceeds from Gospel Lessons, including sponsorships, go to charity. Casey Griffiths, it is an absolute honor to have you on the show. Thank you for agreeing to come on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
You know, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed your podcast, Church History Matters. I've been a big fan of listening to that, not just because you and Scott do such a good job of contextualizing church history and kind of understanding it, but you answer the hard questions. So often people skip over those or avoid them. And it's too easy to avoid the landmines. You guys just run straight through the field and hit all the landmines, but do it in such an amazing way. I really appreciate that because a lot of people have legitimate questions about stuff. So you guys have done an excellent job with that. Thank you.
That's a novel way of putting it, because most people that run into fields full of landmines would be seen as pretty dumb, but Scott and I, Scott especially, I'll compliment him, is very fearless when it comes to church history. You know, his attitude is, let's talk about it, and it's never going to get better if we don't have the courage to face it and discuss it. I'm a little bit more hesitant than he is sometimes, but he's emboldened me as well.
You guys are great on that, and I appreciate it. And my understanding is you guys are going to be doing the Come Follow Me video series with Scripture Central for this next year, for the Year of Doctrine and Covenants. Is that right?
That's right. We're going to pivot a little bit, and instead of doing topics in church history, which is what we have been doing, we're going to be going through the Doctrine and Covenants. And we were a little bit hesitant to do that because there's so many great Come Follow Me podcasts out there, and we're friends with a lot of them. But we also felt like if our topic is Church History Matters, the most impactful, the church history that matters the most is the context of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, those scriptures. And so we're going to do it this year, and then after it's over, you know, we'll probably go back to doing topics in church history again. But for now, we're having a blast. We've already filmed several episodes, and we're making our way through the Doctrine and Covenants, and it's enjoyable. It's a ton of fun.
Oh, that's exciting. I mean, we're recording this at the end of December, and so your Come Follow Me podcast is going to start probably here in a week or so, is when it'll probably go online, I would imagine. Yeah. And that's going to be exciting. I mean, if you're covering things like you guys do with the Church History Matters podcast, it's going to be excellent. So for anybody who listens to the Gospel Lessons YouTube channel, I would highly encourage you guys to do two things. Number one, listen to Scott and Casey on the upcoming Come Follow Me. That's going to be excellent. And then secondly, if you want to go back and look at the topics, especially some of those difficult and sensitive topics in church history, the Church History Matters podcast that they've done, I haven't found anything better than that, especially the way they contextualize it. So again, thank you. But I mean, this series in talking about false traditions, which is why you're on here today, but you had a topic that you wanted to share, something that is around false traditions. And the tradition or some of the beliefs of some people, I've come to some of this outside of the church, even some inside the church, I've heard, is that, hey, maybe Joseph Smith was in it for the ladies, maybe he's in it for the money and the power. And that idea has kind of festered in some pockets and certainly outside the church. And one of the pieces of evidence that they seem to point to is that in Nauvoo, Joseph lived in a mansion house. And so and they're like, aha, see, he really was in it for the money and the power and the prestige and whatever. So take us through that idea and the realities behind us.
Yeah, I suggested this question because I had a student come up to me and sort of say, "Hey, if Joseph Smith was such a man of the people, why did he live in a mansion house?" And I think it's been perpetuated too because in the back of the scriptures where they have church history photos, they only show the mansion house in Nauvoo. And the photograph makes it look like the mansion house is, a pretty impressive big structure. When in reality, I mean, there's a couple things you should know. First of all, the recent purchase of these sites from Community of Christ has allowed us to do more research. We already knew all this stuff, but now we can go in and film and everything like that. And we're producing some videos that will walk you through these structures. But Joseph Smith didn't live in the mansion house for almost the entire time he was in Nauvoo. He lived there for around the last 8 months of his life. And I also want to point out, he didn't live there as his home. He rented rooms in the mansion house. So let me set up the thing. Let me set this up a little bit. If you go to Nauvoo, and everybody should go to Nauvoo and see these sites for themselves, the place where Joseph Smith lived, and actually where most of the stuff that happened in Nauvoo took place, is called the Joseph and Emma Smith Homestead. And it's, about 100 yards away from the mansion house. And it is a much more humble structure. It's pretty much a log cabin. I'll put it that way. It even looks bigger today now because Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, built on an additional wing. But if you were to go to Nauvoo in, say, 1840, you would get off the boat, because that's right where Joseph Smith's house was. It was right next to the dock where most people would disembark. Most people that came to Nauvoo came up on a steamboat, on a paddle boat. There's this log cabin here. It is a 2-story log cabin, so I guess that's kind of nice. But when you walk inside, it's not huge. It's pretty humble, and you can imagine Joseph Smith welcoming you in and saying, "Hey, come on in and have dinner." It does have a nice little room where you can eat dinner, but we're talking like 1 or 2 bedrooms upstairs, and it actually was only the way it was because it was the residence of the superintendent when back before the church moved to Nauvoo, when it was called Commerce. So Commerce was a malarial swamp. The only people that were there pretty much were U.S. Army personnel, because it was right on the border of Indian Territory. And this was owned by the superintendent, Joseph Smith, who's in. It's a much more humble structure than most people realize it is. And we don't always appreciate the fact that Joseph Smith had people coming and going, people living and staying in his house all the time. And that affects the idea too that Joseph Smith did it for the women. I guess people would be implying like the sexual or the lustful side of things. When you see this place, you would have realized that there's not a lot of place to have a private interlude, essentially, because there's so many people there and the place is so small. Now, when they got to Nauvoo, the Lord commanded them to build a temple. This is in section 124. That's not surprising. They try to build a temple everywhere else that they went. But he also gives a new command, which is to build a house for strangers. This is eventually going to be called the Nauvoo House, and is right across the street from where Joseph Smith's living. But this is intended to be, I guess you would say, like the visitor center for Nauvoo, or a hotel for Nauvoo. A place where anybody could come and stay with the saints and see that they're good people and learn and appreciate about the gospel. And hey, hopefully join the church, but if they don't, we'll still treat them well. So they try to build this really big, nice hotel right across the street. And it's going to be a brick structure, and it's going to be super nice, but they're also resource poor. Almost everybody in Nauvoo has come in there with, pretty much just the possessions that they can carry. And they've got to decide and prioritize, are we going to build the temple, or are we going to build the Nauvoo House? And they rightly prioritize the temple. So the Nauvoo House is never actually finished. And the structure that you see there today that they call the Nauvoo House wasn't even built in Joseph Smith's time. It was built from the construction materials left behind for the Nauvoo House. It was built by Emma Smith's second husband, Louis Bideman. And he used it as a hotel. He called it the Riverside Mansion. But because they can't get this nice brick structure done in time as a house for strangers, they go a cheaper and easier route, which is to build a wood frame house, and that's the mansion house. So what we today call the mansion house, I think they used that title to try and convey to people that were coming to Nauvoo that it was a nice place to stay. But the mansion house today currently isn't much bigger than my house I live in Saratoga Springs, and my house isn't huge. Like, this is our starter home, and probably the home we'll die in too, right? The mansion house in Joseph Smith's time did have an additional wing that's been taken down. But when Joseph Smith moves there, it's because he's trying to fulfill the role that the Revelation gives, which is that this should be a house for strangers where they can become acquainted with the church. So it made sense that the president of the church would live there. And again, Joseph Smith doesn't own the mansion house. He rents rooms in the mansion house for his family. And what we actually found out was that the nicest room, which is where Joseph and Emma are staying initially, they only stay in for 2 or 3 months. And then they actually move into the servants' quarters, where the servants that run the mansion house are supposed to live, and they stay there so that the nicest room can actually go to all these visitors that are coming to Nauvoo. So to say that Joseph Smith lived in a mansion is maybe a misunderstanding that just comes from the fact that those photographs are in the back of our scriptures, and everybody gets bored in church and they look at the photos. And so they think, oh, Joseph Smith had a mansion. When you go there in person, the mansion house is actually pretty humble. And when you investigate it further, you find out that Joseph Smith wasn't living in opulence. It would be more correct to say that he and Emma were more like the staff of the mansion house than the masters of the mansion house. Now, the mansion house does have some nice parlors downstairs that were way nicer than the Homestead, where they could meet and entertain people, and a number of prominent people came there. Probably the one that we know the most about is Josiah Quincy. Josiah Quincy is the mayor of Boston. He's also the son of the U.S. President John Quincy Adams, grandson of John Adams. He comes to Nauvoo and meets Joseph Smith and writes a book later on where he discusses meeting Joseph Smith. That's where that famous quote comes from, where Josiah Quincy says, someday a future textbook may be written and ask this question: what historical American of the 19th century exerted the most powerful influence over the destinies of countrymen? And the answer to that interrogatory may thus be written: Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. So he was deeply impressed. If you read the whole thing, he did say some derogatory things about Joseph Smith as well. But that was the mansion house serving its purpose. Now, as time went on and Nauvoo kind of fell into ruin and disrepair after the saints left, most of the buildings surrounding the area kind of fell into disrepair. The mansion house was kept up and kept in good condition by Community of Christ. They stayed behind, and most of Emma and Joseph's children stay in Community of Christ, and they preserve it because it's part of their family heritage. But I mean, now that parts of Nauvoo have been restored, you can actually go and see that, say, Brigham Young probably lived in a nicer house than Joseph Smith did. As did Orson Hyde and Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff. Like, I would say all their houses probably rate as significantly nicer than the Homestead, where Joseph Smith lived most of the time. And we need to keep in mind that the mansion house was not Joseph Smith's house. It was the hotel in Nauvoo. So he's not in it for the money, and it doesn't seem like Joseph Smith ever became rich from his service in the church. In fact, running the church was kind of, surviving one disaster from another. So Joseph Smith died in significant debt, and not because he was terrible with money, but because he just had to pour kind of all of his life and finances and resources into helping and assisting the church. And so any perception that Joseph Smith was in this for money, I think a visit to Nauvoo quickly dispels that when you see the places that he lived and know the sacrifices that he made. Now, there is another Joseph Smith home that we also obtained from Community of Christ. This one was obtained about 12 years ago in 2012, and we just barely restored it back to its 1830s appearance, and it's in Kirtland, Ohio. And if you go there too, you'll see that it's a nice home by 1830 standards, but it would be pretty small by our standards today. And if you look at other homes in the area, like the Newell K. Whitney home, it doesn't excel. It's not exceptional. He's not living in a huge house there either. It seems like he saw his role is to lead the church, and that meant he needed a place to live, but he wasn't living in any place that was particularly grandiose. And we've never really had a sort of church White House, I guess you'd say, a prominent place where the president of the church lives and makes his offices. They tried to do that, actually. In the late 19th century, there was this structure called the Gardo House, which was pretty nice. And John Taylor and Brigham Young both lived there, but then the Gardo House eventually was sold off and torn down. If you go to Salt Lake today, you might have noticed behind, just up the hill from the Church History Library, there's this huge mansion, the McCune Mansion. McCune was a wealthy financier who lived in Salt Lake, and he actually offered that to the church and said, this should be, the church White House. This should be where the president of the church lives. And they turned him down. They took it, but they turned it into a school of music. And the primary reason was that Heber J. Grant didn't want to sell his house. Like, he liked his house and wanted to stay there. And actually, if you tour around Salt Lake, you can still see Heber J. Grant's house and Howard W. Hunter's house and a few others. And none of them are huge or elaborate. In fact, I think the president of the church most of the time lives in a little apartment in a building across from Temple Square, especially as they get older and their health kind of goes into decline. So, I mean, you just can't make that case that Joseph Smith was in it for the money. I guess you could say he did become pretty famous. If you make the case for the women, even a visit to Nauvoo sort of pushes back on that, because you realize, hey, there weren't a lot of places to sneak around here. And it doesn't seem like Joseph Smith was motivated by sex. He was motivated by this desire to create connection among families. One of Joseph Smith's wives that never gets talked about is Fanny Young, who was 56, and she's Brigham Young's sister. And apparently they were at Brigham Young's house discussing eternal marriage. And Fanny Young kind of said, well, that ship has sailed. Like, I'm not married and I'm in my late 50s. And so too bad for me. And Joseph Smith at that meeting said, well, you could be sealed to me. So technically she was his wife. Was there anything sexual going on? No, I don't think so. And that seems to be the case. Brian Hales estimates that about 2/3 of Joseph Smith's wives were eternity-only sealings where they didn't have any kind of physical relationship. Now, there was some that did, and later on it became standard practice in plural marriages to be physically intimate and have children. But it doesn't appear to have been motivated by sex. Just things worked differently in the 19th century, and so I just don't think that was a big motivator.
And if you look back at, starting at the beginning with Joseph Smith, and if you look at all the places he lived, don't try to just cherry pick. And even cherry picking isn't that grandiose, to your point. Yeah. But even if you look at everywhere he lived, I mean, he was living with other people. He was he was never in great opulence, as you said, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. I mean, when you study the homes Joseph Smith lived in, because, for instance, you can go to Kirtland and you can visit, 6 or 7 different places that Joseph Smith lived. There was one home that was his and Emma's that they lived in. That's the house that's just been restored and rededicated. But the narrative that emerges when you study the homes of the prophet Joseph Smith is poor Emma Smith. She just, other than that house in Kirtland, never really had a nice place to call her own. The homestead in Nauvoo was pretty makeshift. In the mansion house, they rented rooms. And then in Kirtland and before, they're bouncing from place to place to place. They live in this little tiny cabin in Harmony, Pennsylvania. That's where most of the Book of Mormon's translated. But you can go see that today. And it's as basic as it gets. And then they live with the Whitmer family. Then when they get to Nauvoo, they bounce back and forth between the Whitneys and the Johnsons and the Morleys. And poor Emma is giving birth in like at the time, their private space would have been a single room in most of these homes. And sometimes they were outright kicked out of places that they were staying. Newell Kay and Ann Whitney, for instance, in Kirtland, were dear friends of Joseph and Emma, but they talk about an Aunt Sally who was not a fan and got really, really upset over the fact that Joseph and Emma were living with the Whitneys and sort of insisted on them being kicked out. And this particular episode happened when Joseph Smith was away conducting church business, and Emma was there by herself with a couple of infants, newborns, and had to, go and find a new place to live. And so they never lived a life of opulence. They never were the richest people in the church. There were a lot of generous people like the Whitneys and the Johnsons and the Whitmers who helped take care of them. But I mean, you can't look at their homes and say that they were doing this so that they would have the biggest house and live under the nicest conditions. Joseph Smith was not a 1980s televangelist where he was asking for money or trying to live in a big house to show the favor of the Lord. He didn't believe in a prosperity gospel, I guess you would say. And that comes across when you get a chance to visit these sites and see them for yourself.
Yeah, I went and did a church history tour just with me and my girls about 18 months ago. All the places, all the locations you just mentioned. And yeah, if you go and do that, you quickly realize he was not in it for the money. Or if he did, he was really bad at it, because he never succeeded in that. And it's clear that was not his motivation with any of it. He was always trying to do what the Lord wanted him to do. That came to.
And maybe that is something bad you could say. Maybe he was just really bad with money. But the people that knew him, I mean, in one Revelation, the Doctrine and Covenants, section 24, the Lord actually tells Joseph Smith, "You shall not have strength in temporal affairs," which could be the Lord's way of saying you're bad at money, or I'm not going to bless you with a lot of money.
I think it's the second way. I think it's like, hey, that's not going to be your thing. Don't get excited about the money.
That's not your calling. And by the way, the people that do talk about, Joseph Smith struggling financially, tend to not say that he was profligate in his spending, but that he was way generous, and that his position as prophet also put him in an awkward place a lot of times. Like across the street from Joseph Smith's home in Kirtland are the remnants of his store, which have been semi-restored. You can't really go in and visit because they don't want you to cross the road there. It's a little scary road. But Brigham Young told an experience once where, somebody would come into Joseph Smith's store and say, "Well, I really like this. How much is it?" And Joseph Smith would give them the price, and they'd say, "Well, if you're going to charge me that much, then I'll just apostatize." And Joseph Smith would say, "No, it's okay. You can take it." And then the next person would come in and say, "Hey, I heard you gave brother so-and-so this for free. Why? And it just kind of captures the paradox of being a spiritual leader, but also having to take care of your family, and people confusing those two roles together. I mean, it still happens in the church all the time, right? Your elders quorum president got you to invest in something, and then it goes sideways and everybody gets upset and leaves the church. You can see the conundrum that Joseph Smith had, where he's trying to find ways to take care of his family, but his role as the leader of the church sometimes conflicted with that and overlapped it. And I mean, he just was a tenderhearted guy. Like, the main reason why Brigham Young shared that story was to basically say, I wouldn't do that. I just tell them tough luck. And if they want to apostatize, that's fine. But that was Brigham Young's personality and not Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith just didn't have the heart to have people leave the church over a business deal. I think Brigham Young had no issues with it, but Joseph didn't do.
That's so true. I love Joseph. Well, thank you so much, Casey. It's been a pleasure having you on this episode, you enlightening us about the motivations behind some of the, what Joseph did and kind of the truths behind some of these claims. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us today and learning about false traditions. Remember to subscribe so future episodes are easier to find. Thanks for watching.